I have a letter. You should remember that letter.
Authorizing me to move the matter. Robert, I want to move the matter.
We have a letter from the EPA.
Numerous occasions.
That is why, you see here what happened, eh?
What you don't understand?
Let me say, I didn't want to say it all the time, but let me say, you see, money is the enemy of truth. Don't forget what I tell you. Listen to what I just said. Money is the enemy of truth. People seeing that it have a piece of money coming, but it behind cellophane paper, so they're not seeing how much them want to get in the cellophane paper. And that is exactly what's happening to the EPA at this point.
Okay, so today we're diving deep into something that's pretty crucial for the 42 estate constables.
Right.
And it's basically this question. If they take Robert Romoutar to court, what could they actually gain from it? What's in it for them?
Right. Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? What's the point of all this legal stuff?
Exactly. And we've got this in-depth document that kind of breaks down the potential benefits they could see.
Interesting. So let's unpack it.
Yeah, let's jump right in. So right off the bat, this document points to what it calls unlawful representation and procedural misconduct.
Okay, so what does all that actually mean for the officers?
Well, it seems to suggest that Romoutar maybe wasn't operating with the proper legal authority that he should have been.
That's not good.
Yeah, and there's this really important claim in here that some officers were registered in legal cases without even fully agreeing to it.
Wow, so they were basically dragged into it without knowing.
It seems that way. And then there's also this whole issue of alleged misrepresentations about the status of those two big cases, ST-0615 and ST-2217.
Right, the ones about the constable's working conditions, if I remember correctly.
Exactly, those ones. And the document argues that these misrepresentations could have really hurt the officer's legal standing.
So taking Romoutar to court could be a way to clear up all that mess from the past.
Yeah, potentially. It's
Yeah.
like hitting the reset button and trying to get some fairness back into the process.
Makes sense.
Now, moving on from the procedural stuff, there's also this whole other can of worms about financial management.
Oh, right, this document didn't hold back on that either.
Not at all. And the big concern here is that Romoutar was collecting legal fees, but wasn't really being open or accountable about how that money was used.
Yeah, the officers had basically zero clue what was happening with their contributions.
Exactly. And so by taking legal action, they could potentially force a full accounting of those finances and get some answers about any potential, shall we say, irregularities.
Yeah, that reminds me of.
Oh, and speaking of irregularities, things get even more interesting because the document brings up a potential conflict of interest.
Oh yeah, the whole thing with Harrison Thompson. What was his involvement again?
So basically, the document alleges that Romoutar and this Thompson guy were working really closely together, maybe a little too closely.
And that ended up hurting the officers. How?
Well, the document says that this cozy relationship led to claims being misclassified and just plain misleading information being submitted in legal filing.
I have a letter. You should remember that letter.
Authorizing me to move the matter. Robert, I want to move the matter.
We have a letter from the EPA.
Numerous occasions.
Which of course put the officers at a huge disadvantage.
Exactly, potentially facing unnecessary delays or being stuck with bad legal strategies, all because of this alleged collaboration. So, by challenging these actions in court, the officers could get a fresh look at those past decisions and maybe even reverse some of the damage.
Right, that's the hope anyway.
It is, and it's important to highlight that this document doesn't just talk about procedural missteps. It actually points to real harm suffered by these officers.
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't just a bureaucratic headache for them.
Not at all. We're talking financial losses and serious mental distress. The document even mentions specific things like the alleged misrepresentation of case statuses and those private negotiations with RBC that went on. All of that apparently undermined the officers' interests and just dragged out their search for justice.
It sounds like they really felt betrayed by the people they were relying on.
Absolutely. And legal action could give them a platform to finally get compensation for all of that and have those harms officially acknowledged.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential benefits. What about the legal basis for all of this? What kind of legal arguments does the document use to justify holding Ramutar accountable?
Well, it throws around a few legal terms, but I'll try to break them down. So one big one is misfeasance in public office.
Which is a fancy way of saying what?
Basically abusing your position of power, like if you're in a position of authority and you misuse that for your own gain or to hurt others.
Ah, I see. So Ramutar's alleged actions could fall under that category. What else?
Then there's breach of fiduciary duty. Now this one's all about mishandling money that's been entrusted to you, especially if you were supposed to be managing it for someone else's benefit.
Right, so that ties into the allegations about the legal fees.
Exactly. And then there's negligence. This is basically saying that someone didn't act with reasonable care, and as a result, someone else got hurt or suffered losses.
So failing to protect the officer's interest would be a form of negligence in this case.
Precisely. And lastly, there's conspiracy and collusion, which is pretty self-explanatory. Working with someone else, in this case Thompson, to deceive or manipulate people for your own benefit.
All you heard the lady from Royal Bank? I was told I wasn't there. Look how happy she is to go. Remember when she got her ass tied up in the court? She said that the client wants senior counsel attend to it. Or you can remember that? So where the senior counsel gone now? Yes. But you see, we asked them for a piece of money and they didn't too like it. But now it urged me a little more to go for a little more. Especially when they lose him at the Privy Council. You see?
So all these legal principles basically lay the groundwork for the officers to seek some kind of remedy, right?
Exactly. They provide the legal framework for holding Ramutar accountable and getting justice.
Makes sense. Now, assuming the officers do go ahead with legal action, what are some specific things they could realistically hope to achieve?
Well, the document outlines a few potential outcomes. First, they could formally name Ramutar as a defendant in the legal proceedings, which would force him to answer for his alleged actions directly.
So no more hiding behind the scenes.
Right. Then, they could seek a legal declaration that officially confirms that his actions were unlawful. This would be a huge win in terms of setting things right.
It'd be like a public acknowledgement that wrongdoing occurred.
Exactly. And of course, they could pursue financial compensation for any losses they've suffered as a result of his actions.
That's the practical side of things. Makes sense to try and recover what they've lost.
Absolutely. And lastly, this whole thing could potentially trigger disciplinary or even criminal investigations into Ramutar's conduct. Now, that's a whole other level of accountability.
Wow, so there are a lot of potential avenues they could pursue.
There are. And the document ultimately suggests that by taking these steps, the officers could achieve justice, get back what they've lost financially, and finally hold those responsible accountable for their actions.
So in a nutshell, this deep dive shows us that legal action against Ramutar could be the key to righting some serious wrongs.
Exactly. And it raises some really important questions about trust, responsibility, and what happens when that trust is broken, especially when it involves people who are supposed to be protecting and representing others.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think about the systems we have in place and how we can make sure they truly serve the people they're meant to protect.
Absolutely. And that's something for all of us to ponder. Until our next deep dive, keep asking those tough questions. Okay, so today we're diving in something that's pretty interesting. It's this whole situation in Trinidad and Tobago that, involves these retrenched officers. Basically, imagine this, right? You've got this second group of officers, and they're all set. They registered for legal action, paid their dues, but then their case just hits a wall before it even starts.
Yeah, it's a real head-scratcher. We see this kind of thing happen sometimes in these group legal situations. You think you're all in it together, but then things get, messy.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got some documents here detailing their potential legal options, and what we really want to do today is help you, our listener, understand what you could do. What avenues are open to you if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, where you hit a roadblock in your pursuit of justice.
Absolutely. Understanding the legal side of things, the basic principles, It can be a huge help, really empowering if you end up in a tough spot like this.
So to get everyone up to speed, there were like these two waves of officers who were, trying to get some legal recourse. The first group, they were registered by this guy named Harrison Thompson. And their payments were collected by, hang on, let me check the name again. Yes, a Ramotar. And their case, at least in some form, did actually move forward.
Right.
But then, about a year later, a second batch of officers, they also registered with Harrison Thompson, and this time, the payments were collected by a retrenched officer named Timothy Rudall.
And that's where things get a bit tricky, right? Because the first group, they had their day in court. But the second group, their case never even got off the ground. They were essentially told to wait their turn because of the first case still being active.
Yeah, it's like being stuck in a legal waiting room forever, with no idea when your number will be called. And to make things worse, they made their payments, expecting things to progress, but then, nothing. No updates, no communication. So the big question for us today is this. What can these officers actually do? They held up their end of the bargain, paid what they were asked, but the legal action they were promised just never happened, and this other case became like this big roadblock they couldn't get around.
It really boils down to a fundamental expectation, right? When someone offers a service, especially something as crucial as legal representation, and they take your money, you expect them to follow through.
Right, makes sense.
So let's break it down.
Okay.
First, we have the Estate Police Association, the EPA, which is their union. And then we have Harrison Thompson, who is the industrial relations officer involved. What kind of legal arguments could these officers make against them?
Yeah, what can they actually do?
Well, the most basic argument is probably a failure to provide legal representation. You could also call it a breach of duty. Think about it this way. The EPA, through Thompson, they registered these officers, they took their money. That's essentially a promise, like, hey, we're going to represent you in this. But then they didn't even start the case. That's a pretty clear violation of that promise and a violation of their duty as a union to, represent their members fairly.
Yeah. If you're union, you know the group that's supposed to have your back. If they tell you they're going to fight for you and take your money, you'd expect them to, actually fight for you. So what other legal angles could they use?
They could argue negligence and professional misconduct. Both Thompson and the EPA had an obligation to act with reasonable care and skill in this whole situation.
Right.
But knowing about this first case that was already going on, they didn't really communicate clearly about possible delays, and they didn't try to manage the second case separately in a proactive way. That could be seen as them not really caring about the legal rights of the second group of officers. And you have to think about this. The delay itself can really hurt their case. Evidence might be harder to get, and the whole thing is just, it's stressful for everyone involved.
Yeah. It's like they dropped the ball and these officers are left paying the price. So it's not just about what they did, but also about what they didn't do.
Exactly. Now, the documents also mentioned fraudulent misrepresentation. That's a more serious accusation.
Okay, so what would that involve?
It hinges on whether Thompson knew the first case was a big problem that wasn't going away, but still told the second group that their case would move forward without a hitch. If he basically made a false promise on purpose to get them to pay up and register, that could be considered fraud. It's about whether there was a deliberate deception.
So if these arguments actually hold up in court, what could the officers realistically expect to get from the EPA and Thompson?
There are a few possibilities. First, they could go after financial compensation to cover all the losses they've had because of the delay and lack of representation. That could be stuff like financial strain from not having their jobs, the cost of getting new legal advice on their own, and just the general stress and hardship they've been through.
Right.
Second, they could try to get an injunction from the court. Basically, that's a court order that forces someone to do something specific. In this case, it could force the EPA to finally get moving and start the second case.
Makes sense.
And then finally, there could be internal repercussions for Thompson within the EPA. Disciplinary actions, maybe even getting removed from his position.
So there's a range of potential outcomes depending on how they choose to proceed and what the court decides.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to Timothy Rudall, the officer who collected the money from the second batch. What kind of legal trouble could he be facing?
It seems like he could be facing both civil and criminal claims. On the civil side, the main one would be fraud and misappropriation of funds. Basically, if he took their money specifically for legal representation, but didn't actually send it where it needed to go, or didn't make sure the legal process actually started, That could be seen as a serious breach of trust, like he mishandled the funds they entrusted to him.
Right. So it's not just about taking the money, but about what happened or didn't happen afterward.
Right. There's also the issue of unjust enrichment, which is another potential civil claim.
Okay, break that down for us. Unjust enrichment. What's that all about?
Well, imagine someone getting a benefit that they didn't really earn. That's unjust enrichment. In this situation, if Mr. Rudel took the officer's money that was meant for legal fees, but then because of him, no legal services were actually provided. Either he didn't do anything with the money or just didn't manage it properly. If that's the case, he's basically benefited unfairly at their expense.
I see. So he's profited while they've been left high and dry. And there's also the possibility of criminal charges, right? Specifically, theft by deception.
Right. That's a bit different. With criminal charges, you need stronger proof, and it really comes down to intent. The Larceny Act in Trinidad and Tobago, it says that if Mr. Rudel knowingly took their money by misleading them about their case, like telling them it would move forward when he knew it wouldn't, and he did that with the intention of keeping or misusing their money, then that could be a crime. It all boils down to whether he intentionally deceived them to get their money.
Okay, so for the officers, if they decide to go after Rudolph specifically, what are they hoping to achieve? What are their goals?
If they go the civil route, they'd probably try to get a court order that makes him give back the money they paid him. They could also file a formal police report, which could kick off a criminal investigation into whether he committed fraud or misappropriation.
Right.
And no matter what happens with any criminal proceedings, they could also file a separate civil lawsuit against Rudel to try to recover the money they lost because of him.
So lots of potential legal avenues there. It sounds like they've got a pretty strong case.
Yeah, it does seem that way, yes.
This whole situation must be incredibly frustrating for the officers involved. It's like they did everything they were supposed to, but the system failed them.
Yeah, it is a frustrating situation.
Let's switch gears now and talk about the Special Tribunal of the Industrial Court. What potential arguments could the officers raise against them?
This is where the idea of access to justice comes in. The main argument here is about their right to a fair trial, which includes having your case heard in a reasonable amount of time. By letting the problems with the first case completely stop the second case from moving forward, the tribunal might have accidentally denied the second group of officers their right to a timely resolution. It's like their case got put on hold indefinitely, and that's not fair.
And the documents also talk about the tribunal failing to properly manage the case docket. What does that mean exactly?
Well, think of a court's docket like a schedule of all the cases they have to deal with. For a court system to work well, it has to manage that caseload effectively. If one case is allowed to completely paralyze another, especially when they involve different groups of people, it suggests there might be a problem with the tribunal's administrative processes. Ideally, the second group's case should have been handled on its own merits, separate from the first case.
So what can the officers actually do about the special tribunal? What are their options?
They could try something called a judicial review. It's basically when a higher court looks at the decisions and actions of a lower court or body to make sure everything was done legally and fairly.
Right.
In this case, a judicial review could examine how the tribunal handled things and why the second case has been delayed for so long. They could also ask the court to make a declaration that their right to a fair trial has been violated. And finally, they might be able to seek compensation for any legal and financial losses they've experienced because of the delays caused by the tribunal.
It sounds like they have multiple paths they could take within the legal system.
They do. It's important to remember that they're not powerless in this situation.
But the documents also mention some other avenues for recourse outside of the courtroom, specifically filing complaints with the Ombudsman and the Law Association. Can you tell us more about those options?
Sure, these are really important ways to hold people accountable even if you don't go to court. The Ombudsman is like an independent investigator. They look into complaints about unfair treatment or bad administration by government agencies and other public bodies. So the officers could complain to the Ombudsman about the EPA, the Special Tribunal, even Harrison Thompson.
And what could that lead to?
Well, the Ombudsman could investigate and recommend changes, maybe even hold those individuals or entities accountable for what happened. It could even lead to a public inquiry, which would shine a light on the whole situation.
Okay, and what about the Law Association? What role do they play?
The Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago, they're the professional body that oversees lawyers in the country. So if any lawyer involved in this whole thing acted unethically or did something wrong, the officers could complain to the Law Association. That could trigger a disciplinary process, and in some cases, it could even lead to serious consequences for the lawyer, like being suspended or even disbarred.
So it's a way to make sure that legal professionals are held to a certain standard.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say you're one of these officers or anyone else facing a similar situation where your legal representation has stalled. What are the most important immediate steps you should take based on what we've discussed?
The first thing you absolutely have to do is gather all the evidence you can. That means any official receipts you have for payments you made to Rudall or Thompson, any emails, letters, text messages, anything that proves you were promised legal action or that explains why things have been delayed. You also need any official documents from the EPA related to your registration for the lawsuit. Basically anything that supports your side of the story.
Okay, solid first step. What comes next?
Given what we know about the money situation, they should seriously consider filing a formal complaint against Timothy Rudall with the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. This could start a criminal investigation into possible fraud or misappropriation.
And what about taking civil action?
They should talk to a civil attorney right away. A lawyer who has experience in these kinds of cases can help them figure out how strong their case is against the EPA and Harrison Thompson.
Right.
And then the lawyer can help them file a lawsuit to try to get compensation for all the harm they've suffered.
And what about the special tribunal?
Yeah, the lawyer should also look into whether they can apply for a judicial review against the special tribunal. That could be a big step in pushing the tribunal to fix the problems that have stalled their case and maybe even force their case to finally be heard.
So taking all of this together, what's your take on the legal strength of the second batch of officers' position?
Well, from what we've seen, their legal position seems pretty solid. They could potentially bring claims against several different parties because they weren't given the legal representation they were promised and paid for. The fact that they registered and paid is strong evidence that they had a legitimate expectation of legal service, and that clearly didn't happen. All the different legal strategies we've talked about give them some real options to seek justice and get compensated for all the setbacks they've faced.
It's really a cautionary tale. It shows that even when you think you're doing everything right to get legal help, you can still run into serious roadblocks.
Yeah.
This whole situation with the retrenched officers in Trinidad and Tobago, it really highlights how complicated legal representation can be, especially when you're dealing with organizations like unions and the ins and outs of court procedures. It can be really confusing and even risky.
Yeah, and what's really interesting here is how the administrative problems of one case could have such a huge impact on another group that's completely separate. It makes you think, when you're relying on a group or an organization for legal help, what questions should you ask? What safeguards should you look for? How can you make sure your case gets the attention it deserves and doesn't get lost in the shuffle?
That's a really good point. It's something we all need to think about. So for everyone listening, we'll leave you with this final thought. In a society that values justice, how can we make our legal systems better? How can we make sure that situations like this don't happen? That everyone has a fair chance to have their issues addressed and their voices heard, no matter what? It's a big question, and it's something we all need to think about and work towards. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.